Hello students. This is a new approach that you're not used to, I'm sure. So just bear with me on this and we'll try and do our best. And any questions you have, feel free to contact me. Probably the best way to contact me at this point is my online account at home. And that's Desario, DESARIO, JP @AOL.com. Because I'm doing most of my work from home now, that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. So please make use of that. Before we start our lecture today, I just again want to make sure that all of you are being safe, and to repeat from my perspective on this is not a political hoax. This is a real issue. If anyone's telling you a hoax, please do not believe them. I want you all to be safe and sound and stay healthy. So please try and do social distancing to the best of your abilities. All right, what we want to talk about today is, the last time we met, we started talking about political parties. And the first thing we did in regard to political parties is we asked a number of general kinds of questions. So we were talking about what are the functions of political parties, and then we talked about the structure of U.S. parties. We asked why a two-party system, and in talking about that, we talked about our political history in the United States and how the first major political issue that we addressed in our country was whether or not you supported or opposed the United States Constitution. And that gave rise to the first two parties, and because it was a yes or no question, the parties were the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. So what we said is based upon that history, then what we do in the United States is we institutionalize the two-party system. So in the United States, we have single-member districts and plurality vote, whereas some countries have at-large districts and proportional vote. And we went on to explain how if you had at-large districts and proportional vote, like some European countries do, how that could lead to multiple parties, and how our system really mitigates against the significance of third parties. The other thing we then talked about was the responsible party model, and we talked about that in the context of how in the United States we don't really have a responsible party model. And what we mean by that is anyone can run as a Democrat or a Republican if they get the nomination of their party, but once they're elected, they can pretty much do whatever they want. Whereas in other countries, again, many of the European countries, they have a responsible party model, which means that once you're elected under the label of your party, whatever it is, the Labor Party, the Conservative Party, you then must, by definition, enact that party's platform. And if not, you can be removed from office. So those were some of the background kinds of things that we were talking about. And what we want to do today is talk about the next part of this, which is the history of our two parties in the United States. And when we talk about the history of our political parties, what we want to talk about are types of elections. So what we're going to say is, historically in the United States, there have been four different types of elections. Critical elections, or electoral realignment, maintaining elections, deviating elections, and electoral de-alignment. So we're going to go over these terms, we're going to define them, and then what we're going to do is ask the question of, where are we right now? Where are we right now? So, in November, all of you students will have an opportunity to vote in regard to the presidential election, vote in regard to elections for the House of Representatives, vote in some cases for election for the Senate, although that's not going to happen in Ohio. And what I want to know is, what's the larger political significance of these elections? How do they fit into these terms? So let's define these terms. And we'll start with this critical election or electoral realignment. A critical election or an electoral realignment is the most important kind of election. It's an election where party loyalties are actually changed, creating a new major majority party. So in other words, it would be a kind of situation where people who were loyal Democrats become loyal Republicans, or vice versa. Loyal Republicans become loyal Democrats. And when I say loyal, what I mean by that is they actually change their party affiliation and remain committed to their new party affiliation for most of their lifetimes. Now, why does this happen? Why would people change their party loyalty? Well, according to political scientists, this usually occurs because of some new overriding issue or concern that has a major impact on how voters view the two parties. So there's something huge, something big that divides the parties. Now, one of the things that we're going to tell you is there have only been a very few critical or electoral realignment elections in our history, but that once we have this critical or realigning election, it has a major impact on politics for about 40 to 50 years. And we'll give examples of that in a little bit. So that's what a realigning or critical election is. Then we have what's referred to as a maintaining election. So a maintaining election is when voting groups follow their usual party preferences as established by the last critical or electoral realignment election, and the dominant party of the era continues its dominance. So what would that mean historically? Well, political scientists all agree that in 1932, we had a critical election. And it centered around the New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So up until 1932, the Republican Party was the dominant party in the United States. And because it was a dominant party, it won most of the presidential elections. And it won most of the congressional elections. So it controlled Congress and it controlled the presidency. Most people consider themselves to be Republicans more than those who consider themselves to be Democrats. But as a result of the Depression, where we had the most severe economic recession in our history, we see that the parties take very different perspectives on how to deal with that issue. So the Democrats say, hey, government must play a role in helping our economy and helping the average person in the United States. So it really is the beginning of what some people refer to as the welfare state, the idea that government has an obligation to help people. Whereas the Republican Party, dominated by very conservative economic interests and with a strong belief in the idea of the free market, thought that it was improper for the government to intervene in the economy. And Hoover would say things like, the market is self-correcting. So we have the stock market crash in 1929. 3 years later, we had election politics for the 1932 election between FDR and Hoover. And they have very different perspectives. FDR saying, New Deal, we have to create jobs, we have to help people financially. And remember that still by 1932, unemployment in the United States was about 25%. 25%, think about that. 1 out of every 4 people couldn't find a job. People can't pay their rent, can't buy food. People living in parks, people living in cardboard boxes. Tent cities. It was an economic disaster. And oh, by the way, some economists, including Trump economists, are predicting that as a result of the coronavirus, unemployment in the United States may get up to 20%. Think about that. That is profound. What will that mean? And you can see that President Trump, an avowed capitalist, has tried now to provide a new economic approach by government, which would mean that he would spend $1 trillion. And remember what we said about where we were with our government deficit to begin with. We're already $1 trillion in debt. So if we're going to spend another $1 trillion, what's that going to mean for the deficit? Well, that's going to be a disaster. But what you have is 2 bad alternatives. Either we increase the national debt, or if we don't, we have unemployment that could hit 20%. Either one of those 2 things is not a very encouraging thing for our economy and our society. This is a disaster. There's no doubt about it. So those are the kinds of issues that confronted us in 1932. And the American people, after considering the perspectives of the Democrats and Republicans, overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A critical election. We go from a dominant Republican era throughout the early 1900s to a dominant Democratic era from the 1930s into the 1980s. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. All of this to try and explain what we mean by a maintaining election. So what's a maintaining election? A maintaining election is when voters follow their usual party preference as established by the last critical or realigning election, and the dominant party of the era continues its dominance. So when FDR is elected in 1932, we said that's a critical election. When he's re-elected in 36, it's no longer a critical election because we already are in a dominant Democratic era. It's a maintaining election. When he was elected in 40, it's another maintaining election. When he's re-elected in 44, it's another maintaining election. He dies in office. His Vice President Truman becomes president. He wins election in 46. That's a maintaining election. The election of John Kennedy in 1960, maintaining election because he's a Democrat. The election of Johnson in 64, maintaining election. The election of Jimmy Carter in 76, a maintaining election. Because the dominant party of the era continues its dominance. Then what we have is what we refer to as a deviating election. So what's a deviating election? Well, a deviating election is when a large enough number of citizens identified with the major party of the era respond to short-term conditions or a particular candidate and vote the other party into office. So what does that mean? So what that means is, okay, if we're in this dominant Democratic era from the 30s through the 80s, you would have a maintaining election if the Republicans ever won the presidency. Excuse me, we'll have a deviating election if the Republicans ever won the presidency. And again, to define this, we said it's when a large enough number of citizens identified with the major party of the era respond to short-term conditions or a particular candidate and vote the other party into office. So again, for the 30s until early 80s, it would be a deviating election whenever the Republicans won. Now, the other thing to know about a deviating election is it's still a dominant era for the other party, even when the Republican Party, in this case, has office. So although the other party is now in power, we know that its tenure will be limited, and voters in the future will again align with their original party. So we said, so why does this happen? Voters responding to short-term conditions or a particular candidate. So let's give you examples then from the 30s through the 80s of deviating elections. The most significant deviating election during this time was from 1950 through 1960 with the election of President Eisenhower. Why was President Eisenhower, as a Republican, able to win election? Well, think about this person. So we said responding to short-term conditions or a particular candidate. President Eisenhower was one of the most revered military leaders in the history of the United States. He had command of all of our battle troops in Europe. He successfully waged the defeat of the Nazis. And many people said, but for Eisenhower, we might all be speaking German today. That's how important he was. So when he comes back from World War II, a war in which millions of people die, I mean, this is the most extensive war in human history. He's a hero. People love Eisenhower. They exalt him and his accomplishments. So the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, believe it or not, when he comes back, ask him to run under their party platform for President of the United States. And Eisenhower, who was not a very political person, said he didn't know if he was a Democrat or Republican. So he actually goes back to his home state, starts talking to people, and found that many of his friends and neighbors were Republicans in that state. So he was going to run as a Republican. So Eisenhower's candidacy wasn't a repudiation of democratic ideology. It was the exaltation of a war hero, of an incredibly special person who was exalted by our society. But as we said, the tenure of the Republican Party in this critical election era of Democrats would be limited. So Eisenhower was able to win two terms, but once he's no longer able to run, John Kennedy is elected president, a Democrat, making it, what? A maintaining election. And Lyndon Johnson, another Democrat, making it a maintaining election. So what we have to understand is that when we're talking about deviating elections, it is a change in party But unlike a critical election or electoral alignment, where it's also a change in party, it does not mean a new dominant party. It means a temporary deviation from the majority party because of some characteristic of the candidate or some short-term issue. So another example of a deviating election, according to some, was the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. And why was he elected? I mean, unlike Eisenhower, he wasn't a war hero. But we had the Vietnam War, which was a very unpopular war in the United States, and had been raging for 8 years. And Nixon promised that if voters elected him, he would end the war. So that was a very important temporary issue. So people said, okay, the Democrats haven't ended this war, we'll vote for Nixon, maybe he'll end the war. So again, that's another example of a deviating election. Now, to put this in historical context, what we want to understand is the major critical or electoral realignment elections. And the point is, there have only been a few critical or realigning elections in our history, but that they have a major impact. They determine who voters vote for and ultimately the policies of our country for a very long time. So if you look at party dynamics from the inception of our nation, there's a few major eras. So as we said, first we have this original party conflict. And it's between what we referred to in class as the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. And what were the difference between these two parties? What was the difference? Well, the Federalists were led by Hamilton, and they belonged in a strong central government. They stressed the interests of commerce and business, and therefore hard money. And historically what happens is the Federalists become the Whigs, and then later the Republicans. The Anti-Federalists are led by Jefferson, and they later become the Democratic Republicans and then the Democrats. And they represent the interests of small farmers, debtors, and Southern planters. And what we see is from the inception of our nation until about 1850, that with a small coalition, with a coalition of small farmers, Southern planters, and debtors, the Democratic Party, or the Anti-Federalists, dominated American politics from 1800 until 1850. So from 1800 to 1850, if I were to ask, what's a maintaining election? A maintaining election would have been for the Democrats. If I were to ask what's a deviating election, it would have been for the Republicans. And again, at that time, known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the first critical election that we have in the United States, the first major electoral realignment that we have in the United States, occurs in the 1850s. The 1850s. And again, remember, what does it take to have a critical election? I'm going to go back to that again because this is so important. We say the most important kind of election, party loyalties actually change, creating a new majority party, and it occurs because of a new overriding issue or concern that affects the loyalties of voters. So you need a giant issue that's going to change people's opinions. So what's that big giant issue in the 1850s? Well, it's the issue of slavery. Very important issue that divided us intensely as a nation. So the issue of slavery leads to a realignment of party loyalties. So as we said, the Democrats or the Anti-Federalists were the dominant party up until the 1850s. But in the 1850s, the Whig Party becomes the Republican Party in 1854, and it comes into existence as the party of protest against slavery. So it maintains its base of business, hard money, urban areas, and it attracts the support of the new frontier farmers at that time who strongly oppose slavery, like Kansas and states of that type, Nebraska, Iowa. So the Democratic Party, on the other hand, becomes split over the issue of slavery on a regional basis, North versus South. So Northern Democrats remain Democrats, but Southern Democrats leave the party, splitting up their traditional support. And the Civil War leads to the dominance of Republicans for over 30 years. During this time, Republicans won 8 of 10 presidential races and dominated Congress. Well, the next major election period that had all the characteristics of a critical or electoral realignment, except one, occurs in the 1890s. So we have the election of the 1890s, and we said that it doesn't have one characteristic. Well, what does it have? It has a new issue, and it affects people's allegiance to the Democratic versus the Republican Party. But what it didn't do is it didn't change the dominant party of the era. Republicans remain the dominant party, but because of the new issues of the 1890s, they become even more dominant. So people change from Democrats to Republicans, just further bolstering the dominance of the Republican Party. So what's the new issue? Well, by the 1890s, the fervor of the Civil War and slavery had died out, and the United States was changing. The United States was becoming more industrialized, attracted large amounts of immigrants, became much more urbanized. So the issue of industrialization becomes the new major concern as railroad and steel barons amassed great fortunes, while small farmers continued to be squeezed economically. So the Republican Party talks about the importance of preserving the free market, comes up with the slogan, "What's good for business is good for the nation." And given that our economy was changing, that the number of people who were now working in industrial sites had grown dramatically and become the dominant work site, people wanted to support industry. Now the Democratic Party affected by the populist movement, continued to support small farmers. Well, as you said, the Republicans said what's good for business is good for the country, and defended their conservative policies and won overwhelmingly at the presidential and congressional level. And as a result of this new issue, they had a new, stronger coalition that included many northern major cities, which they had never won before. So it included Northerners and Easterners, business interests, urban workers, New England Yankees, Midwestern farmers. And based upon this new, stronger coalition, Republicans dominated American politics from 1890 till the 1930s. And that brings us to the next critical election or electoral realignment that we just mentioned before, the election of 1932. And the election of 1932 has to be understood within the context of the Depression of the 1920s. As we said, unemployment in the United States up to 25%. And what we see is, despite high unemployment, despite severe economic problems, Republicans continue to preach fiscal conservatism, continue to preach individual effort, and minimal government interference with the free market. So the new issue that emerged was that of positive government. To what extent should government intervene to help our lives? Up until this point in our history, government did very little for the average person. There was no Social Security. There was no disability insurance. There were no public works programs. Government that governed least governed best. So as a result, we have an election between the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Republican Herbert Hoover. And this was probably the best example of conflicting values. And if you remember when we talk about political values, the conflicting values of individual freedom, let people do whatever the hell they want, and no matter what the consequences, we have to live with it, versus notions of social equality. So the Democratic Party